Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Jonathan Scott, who is a professor of history at the University of Auckland, also the author of a number of books. Your previous books were called England's Troubles, another one called When the Waves Ruled Britannia, and the most recent book is called How the Old World Ended. Welcome, Jonathan. Oh, I should say the subtitle, The Anglo-Dutch-American Revolution, 1500 to 1800. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, look, this book, I've spent a lot of time studying English history and the uniqueness of England, right? The place where the Industrial Revolution happened. And I think that's been a puzzle for a lot of historians, trying to figure out why England and why the 18th century. And I think what you've done is you've broadened the scope somewhat and pointed out that the English story is really part of this larger story that involves the Netherlands and the Americas, of course. And for some reason, I think, Dutch history has kind of been sidelined in Anglo-American academia. I mean, we spent a lot of time studying French history, of course, and the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And there's been some talk quite a bit about the glorious revolution in England of 1688. But the idea that this Anglo-Dutch Revolution, which took place across the 17th century, was seminal to the success of England, I think this is something that has been overlooked. So why do you suppose it is that Holland and the Netherlands have been sidelined? I mean, what was astonishing to me when I was reading this book is you pointed out that, by around 1500, the Netherlands had become the most urbanized country in Europe and pretty much ruled the seas. And so you could imagine like an alternative history where, the Dutch were the country that had the Industrial Revolution and everybody in North America was speaking Dutch instead of English. And the world was painted yellow instead of pink through the 19th century. But that didn't happen, right? So maybe, start off by thinking, we'll have to talk about why that didn't happen. But I guess is the reason why we don't spend a lot of time studying Dutch history because they kind of wound up as the losers in this struggle of the Anglo-Dutch Revolution?
I think I'll say two things about this question of why the Dutch have been overlooked. One is there might be an American component to this. I'm teaching a new course with a colleague in Auckland at the moment called Atlantic Revolutions. And if you teach that subject in America, the Atlantic Revolutions are 18th century, they're the American and the French, and sometimes now the Haitian Revolution is the third. But they're quite a compact group in the 18th century. But the Atlantic Revolutions are really, they begin in the 16th century with the Dutch revolt against Spain and revolution that creates a new state. And the second one is English, and the third one is American, and the fourth one is French, and the fifth one is Haitian. So that's the course that we teach. So I think the first thing is Americans are inclined to focus on the 18th century, partly because that's when their revolution was. And then I think the other component of the answer to the question is that it hasn't suited historians of England, 17th and 18th century England, to recognise the extent to which what happens in 17th and 18th century England, which is remarkable and of global importance, derives very substantially from competition with the Netherlands, a competition during which the Netherlands is initially dominant and during which they're eventually overtaken. So this is another aspect of the explanation, I think, for this neglect.
So during this period, the Dutch and the English were, I guess we'd call them frenemies, right? I mean, they were bitter rivals in many ways, but they were continuously, right, borrowing from each other and being inspired by each other and swapping not only commerce, but ideas, and even elites were traveling across this little pond, right? The North Sea, the Western North Sea.
Yes. So, yes, not just rivals and frenemies, but they were also very close allies and dependent on each other for the survival of their Protestant religion and political regimes. So they're close military allies in war against Spain during the Elizabethan period in the 16th century, and then they're equally close military and political and religious allies from the Glorious Revolution in 1689 against France in the 9 Years' War until 1697. So the framework is one of close alliance, but between those two dates, between the Elizabethan and the end of the 17th century, that is, during the 17th century itself, there's an increasingly bitter rivalry between the merchants of these two countries, which it ends up involving 3 very bloody naval wars between 1652 and 1673. So it's a complicated and very interesting situation.
Well, maybe we can start at the beginning in the 1500s and 1600s. I mean, just how different were the Netherlands from the rest of Europe? I mean, I think a lot of people who study early modern period emphasize this shift from the Mediterranean focus, right, and the prosperity of the Italian cities to the Atlantic and the prosperity of the Atlantic-facing countries. But I think you highlight that there was sort of an intermediate step, right, where it was the North Sea, which was where all the action is, and the Baltics, right? And the Netherlands was really the hub of all that activity. So how advanced was Holland, or should I say the Netherlands, relative to the rest of Europe during this time period?
So it depends a bit more precisely on what time we're talking about. But I think what I want to say is that there is a transition from Mediterranean dominance of the European economy and of culture around 1500, the beginning of the early modern period, which is where my book starts, to that domination residing on the Atlantic coast of the North Sea by about 100 years later, by 1600. And the history of the Netherlands is affected by that broad regional transition. But then the other thing I emphasize in my book, which I think is even more important, is that although Dutch economic and cultural development builds on what's happened already in the Mediterranean, which is to say, in Italy, there were very prosperous, rich mercantile cities, which were also culturally rich. Venice is the most famous, Florence and Genoa are other examples. So the Netherlands builds on that and develops its own very prosperous cities in Antwerp and Amsterdam and elsewhere. But what then happens in the Netherlands is quite unique to the Low Countries, to the Netherlands themselves, and has to do with their peculiar geography, which is low, flat, constantly threatened by water, and difficult agriculturally to be successful in. So the Dutch face this challenge quite uniquely, and they develop a unique response to it. And that's very important for my whole argument, because my book is, although it's about how we get a transition to industrial and mercantile economies from agricultural economies, my starting point is, how do you change an early modern European agricultural economy? They're almost impossible to change. And that transition starts in the Netherlands, and it starts partly because it's such a difficult part of the world to grow grain in. So there's a specifically Dutch component of the story that's very important.
Well, and they didn't really have hinterland, so to speak, right? So I was just recently in the Veneto, and I guess Venice, they at least had this breadbasket sort of attached to them, and the Netherlands didn't have that, right? I mean, the only way they could become urbanized was to develop this kind of distance trade, right, where they would bring in grain from the Prussian territories, right, and what's now Poland and Sweden and other places, right? So that was critical and essential to have that international trade in grain, right?
Yes, it is critical, and it's not, though, just because they couldn't grow it themselves. Actually, initially they did grow it themselves, but the question is how they were enabled to increase their grain supply to the point where their urban society could grow incredibly fast, unprecedentedly fast. And as you say, the answer turned out to be by importing grain from the Baltic. And that built on their long-standing medieval relationship to the Hanseatic League in the Baltic and to all those Hanse towns. So they had long traded for timber and salt and fish with the Hanse towns in the Baltic. And what they did is bring grain into that trade and then invent new kinds of shipping that meant that it could transition from a small scale to a bulk, very large scale trade. So that was that was an entirely new historical development, as far as I can see.
But then they also somehow increased the productivity of their own domestic agriculture through all of these technologies. You're coming in from Cambridge at the moment, which I guess was just one big swamp at some point. And was it Dutch people that helped to convert that into tillable agricultural land, or was it Dutch techniques, or did they actually have Dutch people kind of coming over and settling in?
Both. Absolutely. The draining of the fens around Cambridge was completed by Dutch technology and Dutch people and Dutch investors from Amsterdam who created a syndicate and set this all up and made it possible. So the important point here is it's the Dutch grain imports from the Baltic that make it possible to revolutionize the productivity of Dutch agriculture, because as long as local agriculture anywhere is required to grow all of the grain needed by a local society, it can't diversify what it's producing. As soon as you bring grain in from outside, you release the land and you can experiment with the growing of other crops, some of which turned out to do the opposite of grain. Grain deprives the soil of fertility, especially of nitrogen. You have to leave fields fallow for entire seasons for them to recover their fertility. But other crops that the Dutch developed and introduced increased the nitrogen content of the soil. And then also, if you don't have to grow grain, you can increase the amount of animal husbandry, and animals produce manure, which again increases fertility. So it's a virtuous circle. So bringing in grain from outside means you can totally transform agriculture. That's one of the most important things that England then borrows from the Netherlands and applies locally.
Yeah, I did a podcast recently with Mark Kurlansky, who wrote a book on milk and dairy products. And he pointed out that Dutch cows were capable of producing up to 5 times as much milk as cows anywhere else. And partially it was their methods, but partially it was the cows themselves. And so Dutch cows were super popular, and everybody was trying to buy Dutch cows because they'd been bred to be so productive.
Yes. So that's another example that you can not just increase the number of animals, but you can specialize in animal husbandry, and you can experiment with breeding and develop more productive breeds. So the so-called agricultural revolution is multifaceted. It affects lots of different agricultural products, but it's a process that needs to begin, and it can't begin until you release the stranglehold that grain had on pre-modern European and Chinese and world agriculture. Grain was the staple almost everywhere, and that's why pre-modern agricultural economies were almost impossible to change. But the changes started in the Netherlands. And so one thing I argue in my book is you can't change the entire economy until you change what is the basis of the old economy, which is agriculture. You have to change agriculture first to make room for all of the other changes. And it's almost impossible to do, but the Dutch are the people who do it first.
Yeah, and the British, England was pretty agricultural, right? It was really very agricultural. It wasn't nearly as urbanized as the Netherlands, right? It
was totally agricultural. It was one of the least urbanized parts of Europe in 1500. It had only one big city, London, and London in 1500 probably had only 40,000 people. So it was small by European standards. It was less than half the size of big Mediterranean cities like Constantinople and Naples. So England is at the beginning of the early modern period overwhelmingly rural, and it has only one important manufacturing sector and export, and that's woolen textiles, which are a product of one component of English agriculture, obviously sheep raising.
Now, there's this other thing that the Dutch excelled at, which was finance, right? So, we like to point to the creation of the Bank of England as a critical moment in financial history, but the Dutch had figured some of this stuff out long before the English. I did a podcast with someone who is at Yale, and he went over to collect the interest on one of those bonds, one of those perpetual bonds that was used to finance these dikes. I mean, this was in the 1600s. They were raising capital for these large scale infrastructure projects, right?
Yes. So, yes, Dutch banking became incredibly large scale and sophisticated during the 17th century. I mean, the Dutch didn't invent banks. I guess there were important Italian and German precursors, but the Dutch in the 17th century, in the late 16th and 17th century, become the first really predominantly urban society. It's the first human society, not of one large city, but it's predominantly urban. It has a grid or a system of large towns and cities, and they all have a lot of independence. And several of them have their own banks, and the most important is the Bank of Amsterdam, and what becomes the dominant city in that urban complex. So the Bank of England is developed almost a century later and is very much modelled on the Bank of Amsterdam, but it's a national bank. It's not a city. It's not a bank that is located in a single city, because England is a very different political entity from the Netherlands. But in banking, as in many other things, the English are watching what the Dutch have been doing, and then they copy it, but they adapt it and build on it.
And so, what kind of led to the passing of the baton from Holland, or from the Netherlands? I keep saying Holland. I forget that's only one part of the Netherlands, right? The way we use them interchangeably in English, it's inappropriate. But what kind of led to the passing of the baton? I mean, it seems in part like it was almost a takeover. I mean, England was kind of taken over by the Dutch, right? By the end of the 17th century.
England was taken over by the Dutch, but the Dutch were also taken over by England. The key decade, I think, is the decade inaugurated by the Glorious Revolution in 1689. So, I mean, that is a totally spectacular event where a huge Dutch armada, 5 times the size of the Spanish armada of the previous century, successfully lands in England and marches on the capital, and the army and its leader, William of Orange, are invited into London and invited to become de facto rulers of the country, and then instituted as the legal monarchs, as the newly legal monarchs. So this is a totally spectacular military and political event. But what it sets in place is a new order in England, which is initially, at least in my view, an Anglo-Dutch order. And it has several purposes, one of which is to make possible a military defense of Protestant Europe against Louis XIV's France. But another is to make a transnational capital, to make the Netherlands and England safe for transnational capitalism and mercantile investment and oceanic global trade. And that is in turn the culmination of processes that have been in train for more than a century in both the Netherlands and in England. So when you say, when does this takeover happen? It's the culmination of a long process over 150 years or so. And it's not just a takeover in one direction, it's a takeover in 2 directions. And then I just have to add, finally, the 18th century chapter, which comes subsequently, is also very important, because if you want to know why England eventually overtakes the Netherlands, you have to talk about how England was different from the Netherlands and why it ended up applying these Dutch-style developments in a different context that allowed something to happen that hadn't happened in the Netherlands, allowed something to happen that had never happened before in human history, as far as I can see.
And what was that?
What we call the Industrial Revolution, which began in England in about 1780, and which was the long-term culmination of this complex relationship over 300 years. And so the Dutch pioneered the transition from an agricultural to a mercantile and manufacturing economy. But they didn't have an industrial revolution, which is a transition to manufacturing on a much larger scale, at a much greater speed. And also in the English case, it's a different kind of industrialization. It's not just bigger in scale and faster, but it's based not simply on services as well as manufacturing as in the Netherlands, but it's based on manufacturing primarily, making stuff. So how is that possible in England in a way that it had not been in the Netherlands? My answer, is again complicated. Everything is complicated in history, but the single most important answer is England had a unique kind of empire, different from the Dutch, different from the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the French. And what was unique about it was that it was not simply for the import of commodities, but it was for the export of people. And so England was the only one of these early modern European global imperial powers to create a huge English-speaking population somewhere else in the world, which they then forbade to buy manufactures from anywhere except England. And they enforced that prohibition with naval military power. And so the last part of the last component of the story is that the Industrial Revolution was driven by a market in America, which was buying English stuff. And the market in America, the English-speaking American population, which began as an English colonial population and became independent during this period, was growing incredibly rapidly, again, at an unprecedented rate in world history for various reasons. And so that was the final driver. So what you need to get the Industrial Revolution is the whole previous complicated European North Sea history of Anglo-Dutch relations building on the earlier Mediterranean European history. But then you need a unique kind of empire which establishes a big European population somewhere else on the other side of the Atlantic.
So it was really the Navigation Acts that prohibited the Dutch from selling their manufactured goods to this larger market.
Yes, the Navigation Acts are the single most important development in this whole long process, and that's one reason why a very important component of the argument of my book is that the English Revolution of the middle of the 17th century, so we're not talking about the Glorious Revolution now, we're talking about the English Revolution of 1649 that executes Charles I and replaces the monarchy with the Republic. That is an absolutely pivotal development because it puts in place for the first time in England a government that's not monarchical and dynastic, it's republican. It's modelled on the republican government of the Dutch. It's devoted to mercantile and manufacturing economic measures to compete with the Dutch, and the Navigation Acts are the most important of them. So without the mid-17th century English Revolution, none of this long-term stuff would have happened.
But you could also imagine an alternative history where the English and the Dutch created something like an early EU, right? I mean, I learned in the book that the Dutch offered their crown to Elizabeth at one point. And so why didn't William of Orange, upon taking the throne of England, do more to create sort of an economic union between these countries rather than ultimately lead to the continuation of this rivalry?
Well, to focus on the reign of William and Mary, I suppose the most important short answer to that question is that the United Provinces, of which William was stadtholder, not king, but stadtholder, he was an office holder of a certain kind there, they had supported him to lead this very risky invasion of England for quite specific reasons. They wouldn't have supported his invasion of England in order for him to become monarch. I think that was unexpected. It was a development that arose out of unexpected consequences. But what they absolutely would not have supported is the abolition of the United Provinces and its absorption by a federation which would have been dominated by England. And we know that because another important component of the history of the English Republic in the middle of the 17th century is that the English Republic offers the Netherlands a political union in 1651. And it's all very embarrassing because the Dutch, there's nothing that they want less. They've only just won an 80-year war for their independence from Spain. This is now a direct threat to their independence. And to cut a long story short, they say no. And it's partly the bad feeling caused by that no in 1651 that within a few months produces the Navigation Act of 1651, and then the following year produces the First Anglo-Dutch War. So the Dutch fought for 80 years for their independence. They want to be independent. So that's not something that William could have persuaded them to give up.
And so why the difference in colonial practice? I mean, the Dutch did engage in colonial activity, right? And it seems at least the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company, their behavior was relatively similar. But I think you point out that in the Atlantic colonies, the way they settled the New Netherlands was different. Is it because it seems like there was no difference in demographic pressure on England relative to the Netherlands? So why the difference in?
Yes, there was.
There
was actually a big difference in demographic pressure. So I think there are two things here. All of these early modern European global empires are very different. Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch, English, they're all very different. The unique thing about the Dutch Empire is that there's never any attempt anywhere to establish major Dutch populations. The Dutch Empire, their East Indies is different from their West Indies empires, but what they have in common is they're trading empires. Or actually, their Western Empire is for raiding Spanish shipping as well, but they're interested in trade, both in the East Indies and in the Americas. They have communities of merchants. They admit a lot of foreigners. They make no attempt to take missionaries or establish any kind of religious component to their colonies. They've focused on mercantile activities, which include selling manufactures. So the English empire that develops is eventually very different, but you're right that its eastern component, the English East Indies Company, is inspired by the Dutch East Indies spice empire and attempts to compete with it and to copy it, not very successfully, but it ends up being very successful in India rather than in modern day Indonesia, and in importing not spices, but other commodities, especially Indian cotton textiles called calicos. The different component of the English Empire from all the other European empires is the Western Empire, and only one part of that. So in the Western, that is the Americas. In the Caribbean, England's empire is like the Dutch and the French, especially the French. That is to say, it's organized around the Sugar Islands, which become fantastically lucrative from the mid-17th century into the 18th century, and therefore also the transatlantic slave trade from Africa. The different component is England's empire in continental North America. That's the one where it establishes a huge English-speaking population. And there are two reasons for that. One is that England has what is a unique 17th century history of emigration to North America for religious rather than economic reasons. So the so-called Puritans, who begin to travel in large numbers first to Ireland and then to continental North America in the middle of the 17th century. So
Via Holland sometimes,
there's
right?
not an economic
Via the Netherlands sometimes.
via the Netherlands, or sometimes starting in the Netherlands. English Puritans who've gone to the Netherlands for a long time and then who sailed directly from the Netherlands to the Americas. So the first thing is that there's this religious component of the North American empire, but then which is not about trading and manufactures. But then the more important reason is that continental North America is outside the tropical mosquito zone of super high mortality in the Caribbean and in the tropical South. So in those places, nobody lives very long. Both Europeans and African slaves, the mortality rates are out of this world. But in continental North America, where there's a cooler climate, people live and survive longer. So that's why by the 18th century, the English-speaking population of North America has begun to reproduce itself. So in places like Pennsylvania, the population is doubling every 25 years. So by the time, in the middle of the 18th century, by the time the 7 Years' War between England and France breaks out, France has a French-speaking colonial population of 50,000, and England has an English-speaking colonial population of 1.1 million. A huge difference and discrepancy.
Now, shifting to America, I mean, the American Revolution had a lot of inspiration, right, from the French. When you look at the founders, I mean, you quoted John Adams. Apparently, John Adams gave a lot of credit to the Dutch Revolution as an inspiration. But when we study the intellectual origins of the American Revolution, we don't typically think of the Dutch. We think of folks like John Locke, right? Maybe Montesquieu, as inspiration. Is it because the Dutch didn't create a John Locke? They didn't have a Montesquieu. I mean, they had, of course, Spinoza and Grotius, but they weren't the kind of political philosophers that one could look to as inspiration. I mean, did they think of themselves as emulating the Dutch at the time, the founders?
The American revolutionaries, though, were they were absolutely inspired by the English 17th century revolutionaries, and I think that's the most important influence. And Locke was one component of that, but English Republicans writing before Locke were, in my view, more important. But one thing I emphasize in my book is that the people by whom the English Republicans and revolutionaries of the 17th century were themselves inspired, who were the Dutch revolutionaries of the 16th century, were very important for the American revolutionaries of the 18th century. So the Dutch, I think the most important influences in America are Anglo-Dutch, and the Dutch part of that has been forgotten in America. Why exactly is, again, complicated, but one reason might be that when England ends up dominating, the Dutch component of the American founding and of the American Revolution is just quietly forgotten. Another reason might be that America became and remains an English-speaking culture, which then retrospectively trims its history to focus, perhaps, though, as you say, France is an exception to this, but focuses perhaps predominantly on English-speaking influences. But the Dutch were in North America long before the English, and the Dutch were crucial in supplying the first English settlers in Massachusetts and Virginia and in Barbados, with food and other commodities that enabled them to survive before English had a proper transatlantic shipping fleet. And of course, the Dutch were the first people, well, in particular, the Dutch were the first settlers of what subsequently became New York. So the Dutch history comes first, and the Dutch domestic history of successful rebellion against the Spanish monarchy and the establishment of an independent republic is absolutely remembered in 18th century America and is a big inspiration for the American revolutionaries, especially because they're rebelling against England. So taking inspiration from somebody other than English writers is important for them for that reason too.
Well, the other thing I think that the Americans borrowed was this idea of a federation, right? So I think the United Provinces
Yes.
could have been called the United States of the Netherlands, right? And it also inspired the Union in 1707, right? Bringing together Scotland and England into a unified country.
Yes, that's right. So, as you know, one of the arguments in my book is another aspect of what I call the Anglo-Dutch-American Revolution in the early modern period is a series of political revolutions which put in place a new kind of state, which is federated and the product of parliamentary representation and parliamentary votes. And so the United Provinces of the Netherlands is the first one, established in the 16th century, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain is the second, established in 1707, and then the United States of America is the third. And each of these is conscious of its place in a sequence where there is copying and adaptation going on.
Now, the other thing that they had in common was religious. And you talk about sort of the Calvinist world of the 17th century. So
Correct.
in which direction were the religious influences going? Were they going primarily from the Netherlands to England and then on to America?
Short answer. I'm going to try and give you one short answer in this interview. Yes, that is the primary direction. But then the broader context is that the Dutch revolt against Spain in the 16th, which begins in the 16th century and doesn't finish until the middle of the 17th century, is part of a broader, huge, bloody upheaval, which has a military component called called Europe's Wars of Religion, but also has a migrational component, which is that it sets in motion Protestant refugees and immigrants and pilgrims and adventurers, both within Europe and eventually across the Atlantic into the Americas. So yes, it starts with the Netherlands. It has an important English component, and America is the most important recipient. But this is a big migrational churn that goes on for more than 200 years.
So it's not just ideas; it's people. I think you said somewhere in the book towards the end that London has 5 times as many foreign-born people as the rest of England, Scotland, and Wales put together. I mean, was that always true? I mean, was London always the hub of all of this kind of international mingling and immigration?
That's a great question, partly because I'm working on my current book, which is on London as a world city, why it develops into a world city in the early modern period, and migration is a big part of the answer to that. So what I would say about that is that the early modern cities, especially the big ones, which become economically and culturally dynamic, like Venice first, then Amsterdam, then London, migration is, for all of them, a big part of that. They pull in foreigners who are economically useful and culturally interesting. They establish facilities for different religious faiths, for different languages, for exchange, cross-cultural, cross-border exchange of various kinds. So London does do that, but London's not like that, particularly in the middle of the 16th century. It becomes like that between the 16th and the 18th centuries. And when it does, it's building on the example of earlier cities like Venice and Amsterdam, but it overtakes them and exceeds them. It becomes a much bigger and eventually a much more dynamic city by the 18th century than any of its European predecessors for various reasons. But migration is a big part of that, and transnational movement and contact and influence is a huge part of that.
So demographically and economically, I mean, London dominates, but politically, it seems as if the folks outside of London maintained some political power. I mean, in countries like France, if you can control the city of Paris, you can control the whole country, right? But it seems like England, the political power was resting in at least partially the landed aristocrats in the country. Um, why didn't you see the political power centralize as much as you saw the economic power and the
I
population?
think what I want to say about that is that actually political power is much more centralized in England in general and in London in particular than is the case in France. I think France, it's certainly centered in Paris, but France has a handful of really big cities that are not Paris, a couple of which stage major temporarily successful rebellions during the 17th century in a way that never happens in England. So I think London is more dominant than Paris is. But your point about the English aristocracy is right and important. So one peculiar thing about the English aristocracy in European terms is they're rural. And English writers are interested in this. They write about this in the early modern period, that in Spain and in the Holy Roman Empire, German-speaking Europe, and in France, part of being an aristocrat is to live in a city and is to engage in civility and in the cultural behavior of aristocrats. But in England, part of being an aristocrat is to live in the country, in a big country house, and to engage in a modified rural version of aristocratic behavior. So, yes, there is an important aristocracy in England right through the early modern period into the 18th century, even though this transition away from agriculture towards mercantile and manufacturing economy is going on. There is an important aristocracy right through the period, but they're based in the countryside and they become part of this industrializing commercial economy because of the agricultural revolution that England borrows from the Netherlands. Agriculture is itself revolutionized economically, and it produces new trades, new international trades in grain and in many other things. And the English aristocracy become wealthy on the basis of this, and so they become keen on the new mercantile manufacturing economy. They're not excluded from it. In France, you're not allowed to participate if you're an aristocrat in manufacturing and trade. But in England, there's no barrier to doing so, and so there's a mesh by the 18th century between the aristocratic and the mercantile components of the economy. It's very interesting, and it's very unique.
Well, I mean, look, this is a book of transnational history. There was probably a time where if you were in a history department, you had to be an English historian or a French historian or a Chinese historian. I don't think that's true anymore. I mean, I think you can be an Atlantic historian, let's say. Do you think that we have moved away from the national concentration enough? Do you think that these sorts of relationships, these cross-national relationships, are under-researched, understudied relative to the national ones? And I guess one question is, why has there always been this emphasis on national history? Is it because of the emphasis on political history? And as we move more towards, I guess, focus on economics and focus on other aspects of our experience, we're naturally going to move away from a national focus?
I think that last point of yours is very important, and yes, that's true. The focus on national history and a national container for the historical story is very much an aspect of political rather than economic or intellectual history. So economic and historians and also historians of ideas have been much better about understanding the transnational components of the story. A second reason that national history has been so important for so long is that history, as it's taught in present-day universities professionalized in the 19th century, starting in Europe with people like Ranke in the 19th century. And the 19th century was the heyday of the nation state. But the nation state was only really developed in the 18th century, and it can be argued that it's been declining in importance globally for decades now. So it's anachronistic to try to understand early modern history between 1500 and 1800, in my view, within a predominantly national framework. Now, the first part of your question, do I think this is sufficiently recognized? I think there is a movement in the present generation, which is not my generation, the younger generation, within history to be increasingly global, which means to look across borders. And obviously that's influenced by the global world that we live in. But there's also, of course, a huge backlash going on at the moment against this, not least in the United States, an attempt to re-establish the nation, to stop immigration, to reinstate an historical story that is about what is unique about the place where one lives. And that's not just happening in the United States, it's happening everywhere I've lived. It's happening in the UK, where I am at the moment. It's happening in New Zealand as well, where I live. In New Zealand, there's something called post-colonial nation building, which is a new version of New Zealand history meant to rectify the errors of the colonial period. But it's not very satisfactory for me because I don't believe in nation building. I think the world is connected, and it actually always has been.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons why history, I think, is unique is that it serves as the fuel for these national narratives, like you said. And so is the Brexit movement fueled in part by a vision of English history that suppresses the role of these other influences?
Totally.
And the connection to...
Brexit is a key example of what can happen if you let nationalism dominate and tell the story. And it's also what can happen in a country where people are not taught the truth about their own history, the history of the country. And I have a lot of experience of this because I taught history in the United Kingdom for 15 years. And so the island story about the uniqueness of English history, given a sort of geographical packaging, because England is part of an island that is separated by a very small body of water from the European continent. This is a myth, but it's a very powerful one when you combine it with the fact that in the 19th century, incredibly, this very small European state developed the biggest empire the world had ever seen and became the globally dominant military and economic power for about 100 years. So that's powerful stuff. And if you give it a national packaging, then people can get the wrong idea about the country they live in. And I think Brexit is one product of that. It's been hugely damaging. It's very sad, actually. It's meant that young people who didn't vote for it in the United Kingdom now have to go through an extraordinary rigmarole to travel anywhere else in Europe, which was not the case, a few years ago. And imports and exports are much more expensive. And Elton John can't do a European concert tour because all of the rules have changed. It's sad, but hopefully it's temporary.
But is that narrative that sort of downplays the connection between England and Europe being supplemented by a narrative that emphasizes the connection between England and its former colonies, particularly the English-speaking colonies?
I think that was the Brexit idea, that the sense of England as a European country and as part of a European culture and a European history could be replaced by a revived sense of England as part of a global post-colonial, whatever you want to call it, Commonwealth or European or English-speaking transatlantic um, uh, post-colonial connection. My view is that Brexit has been such a disaster, and everybody, or even most people who voted for Brexit now regret having done so. I think Brexit has discredited itself, and I think the government which produced it is about to be thunderously voted out of office. And so I think that idea of an alternative, different, post-European way of understanding England and its history is probably not going to work out. I think we're going to have a period of confusion and self-examination, and it'll be interesting to see what emerges.
Well, one part of this English myth is the notion that England has never been successfully invaded since the Norman Conquest. And of course, we've been discussing how there was a very successful invasion of England in 1688. Why is that not? Why is that not characterized as a successful invasion? Yes, of course, there were people that welcomed the invaders with open arms, and it was retroactively sort of validated. But I mean, shouldn't we be talking about that as an invasion, right? And a successful invasion?
I think professional historians increasingly do. I think professional historians would increasingly not debate that suggestion that 1689 was a successful invasion. But I think the broader public don't understand and accept this because, I mean, one of the glories of modern English history is its role in defeating the Axis powers in 1945. That was a crucial development in modern world history, and it still sets the terms of the way most English people see themselves, and you can understand that, and it's understandable. It just ought to be added that England did not achieve this on its own, and it wouldn't have been able to achieve it without Russian, American, and other alliances and help. But I think it's because of the importance of 1945 that England is not very inclined to admit that it's been constantly invaded in 1066. It was invaded in 1689, and it was 1688, and it was very nearly invaded in 1588. I mean, the Spanish Armada was very nearly successful. Because the easiest way to invade a country in the early modern period is by water. Water is not a defense. It's actually an invitation to invasion. But this is should not be a source of shame. What happens in 1689 is not only an invasion, as you say. There's enthusiastic local collaboration, especially in the city of London. So one of the things that makes England so successful in the end, in the early modern period, is its permeability. The fact that it's actually open to outsiders coming in, making an impact, and then it's good at taking what it can from these people and adapting those things to its own needs and circumstances. I see this as a story of success rather than of defeat or failure or anything like that.
Now, you currently teach in New Zealand. When you teach British history in a place like New Zealand, do you find a different receptivity to the notion that the British narrative of uniqueness is less than fully credible? Right? Do you get is there a different way that people think about British history in the colonies than in England itself?
I'm always saying in response to your questions that there are two parts of the answer. So there are two parts of the answer to that. The one thing I would like to say is that I do think in my case it's easy for me to look at the transnational context for English history because I'm not English and because I'm looking at it from the outside and have always done that. So I think it's easier for a New Zealander and also for an American to do that. It makes perfect sense to us. It's harder from within England to be receptive to that, but of course far from impossible. But the second part of my answer is I don't teach British history in New Zealand. Nobody is interested in British history in New Zealand. So when I was a student in New Zealand, British history was very important, or English history, and that's how I became a historian of England. But that was in the previous generation. We're now in a phase of post-colonial, as I said, nation building, whatever that means. And therefore, the last thing we're interested in is British history. So actually, I do sneak lots of English and British history into my teaching, but only as part of courses like the Atlantic Revolutions course that I've mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me. The latest book is called How the Old World Ended, the Anglo-Dutch-American Revolution, 1500 to 1800. We'll talk again.
Thank you, Greg. I really appreciate the invitation.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.